Lieutenant Emma Rodriguez had been at Naval Special Warfare Command for exactly 13 days when her instructors whispered she was too fragile for elite military operations. Her male colleagues placed bets on how many hours she'd last before washing out. But on the morning of October 17th, when the legendary Hell Week simulation broke 3 veteran SEALs in the first 4 hours, Emma would become the first person in the program's history to complete the full 7-day course that had been deemed psychologically impossible for any human being to finish. The Pacific Ocean crashed against the shores of Coronado Beach as Emma adjusted her tactical vest for what felt like the 100th time that morning. Around her, Class 247 of Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training conducted their daily physical conditioning with the mechanical precision that separated the elite from the merely exceptional. But Emma wasn't running the obstacle course with her class. She stood on the sidelines, clipboard in hand, watching other candidates prepare for training evolutions she should have been leading. Master Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson emerged from the command building, his khaki uniform bearing the trident insignia that marked him as one of the most respected SEAL instructors in the Navy. He surveyed the training compound with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent 28 years transforming civilians into warriors capable of operating in the world's most dangerous environments. When his eyes found Emma, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite disapproval, but something closer to resigned disappointment. "Rodriguez," he called out, his voice carrying across the sand with the authority that had commanded respect in combat zones from Afghanistan to Somalia. "My office, now." Emma jogged across the compound, her boots striking the concrete in a rhythm she'd perfected during countless miles of conditioning runs. The other candidates barely glanced her way anymore. After nearly 2 weeks of being relegated to administrative duties and observer status, she'd become part of the background, invisible in the way that only truly overlooked people could be. Master Chief Thompson's office walls were lined with photographs from successful missions, commendations from grateful nations, and a large tactical map showing current SEAL team deployments marked with colored pins. Emma had studied that map during her previous visits, memorizing the locations where her fellow Navy personnel were currently engaged in operations she'd been deemed unsuitable for participating in. "Sit down, Rodriguez." Thompson settled behind his desk without looking at her directly, shuffling through a manila folder that Emma recognized as her personnel file, the same file she'd watched him review during every conversation they'd had since her arrival at the command. "I've been going over your evaluations again, trying to understand how someone with your academic credentials and physical fitness scores ended up struggling with the most basic aspects of our training program." Emma remained standing, her posture reflecting the military bearing that had been drilled into her during 4 years at the Naval Academy. "Master Chief, if this is about the underwater navigation exercise, I've already submitted my analysis of what went wrong. The compass malfunction wasn't something I could have anticipated, and my backup navigation method successfully brought me to the target coordinates within the acceptable time window." "It's not about navigation, Rodriguez." Thompson finally met her eyes, his expression carrying the weight of someone who'd made difficult decisions about countless careers. "Your technical skills are actually quite impressive. Your academic understanding of special operations tactics is probably better than half the candidates who've successfully completed this program. Your physical conditioning meets or exceeds every standard we've established." "Then why am I reviewing training videos instead of participating in actual training evolutions?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. She'd heard variations of this conversation throughout her military career, always delivered with the careful language of people trying to avoid saying what they really thought. "Because technical competence isn't enough for what we do here," Thompson replied, leaning back in his chair. "Special operations require a specific kind of mental toughness that can't be measured through written examinations or physical fitness tests. When our teams deploy to hostile environments, they face psychological pressures that break people in ways that have nothing to do with their ability to swim underwater or navigate through jungle terrain." Emma felt the familiar cold sensation that accompanied conversations about her supposed psychological limitations. The careful suggestions that she might be too sensitive for combat operations, too concerned with following procedures to make split-second decisions under pressure, too focused on avoiding casualties to accept the brutal realities of warfare. Master Chief, with respect, my psychological evaluations show no indicators of weakness or instability. I've consistently scored in the top percentile for stress tolerance and decision-making under pressure. My leadership assessments from the Academy were exemplary, and my performance during Officer Candidate School exceeded the standards for Special Operations candidacy. Thompson opened the folder and pulled out several documents that Emma recognized as incident reports from her first weeks of training. Rodriguez, let me read you something from Instructor Petty Officer Martinez's evaluation after last week's combat simulation. Candidate Rodriguez demonstrated excellent tactical knowledge and appropriate use of cover and concealment. However, she spent approximately 12 minutes attempting to establish communication with simulated enemy forces instead of neutralizing the threat immediately. Her post-exercise debrief focused extensively on minimizing simulated civilian casualties rather than achieving mission objectives with maximum efficiency. Emma's jaw tightened as she realized the conversation was heading toward the same institutional blind spot that had followed her throughout her military career. The assumption that her careful approach to complex situations represented hesitation rather than strategic thinking, that her concern for civilian casualties indicated weakness rather than professional competence. Master Chief, that simulation involved a hostage rescue scenario in an urban environment. Standard operating procedures require attempting communication before engaging with lethal force, especially in situations where civilian casualties could compromise mission success and create long-term strategic problems for American interests in the region. Standard operating procedures are guidelines, Rodriguez. They're not suicide pacts. Thompson's voice carried the edge of someone who'd operated in environments where hesitation meant death for American personnel. In real combat situations, you don't get 12 minutes to debate the ethical implications of your decisions. You get seconds to choose between protecting your teammates and protecting people who might be trying to kill you. The words hit Emma like a physical blow, though she'd heard similar assessments throughout her career. The suggestion that her methodical approach to complex problems somehow disqualified her from elite military service, despite her consistent success in achieving mission objectives with minimal casualties and maximum strategic value. Master Chief, during that same simulation, my approach resulted in the successful rescue of all hostages, the capture of 3 high-value targets who provided intelligence that prevented future attacks, and 0 civilian casualties. The aggressive approach used by other candidates resulted in multiple friendly fire incidents and the deaths of 2 simulated hostages. Thompson nodded reluctantly. Your results were impressive, Rodriguez. But your methods raised concerns about how you'd perform in situations where communication isn't an option, where negotiation is impossible, and where the only choice is between overwhelming violence and mission failure. Emma stared at the folder on Thompson's desk, recognizing it as the documentation that would determine whether she continued with SEAL training or was transferred to a different program that her superiors considered more appropriate for her skill set and temperament. The same kind of transfer that had redirected her career away from combat roles multiple times throughout her service. What are you recommending, Master Chief? Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The same recommendation she'd received from previous commanders who praised her competence while questioning her suitability for the most challenging assignments. I'm recommending transfer to the Naval Intelligence community, Thompson replied. Your analytical skills would be extremely valuable there, and you'd be working in an environment that rewards exactly the kind of careful thinking that concerns us in direct action operations. Emma felt the familiar burn of injustice in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced during every conversation like this throughout her career. The assumption that her gender and her thoughtful approach to complex problems made her inherently unsuitable for the most demanding aspects of military service, despite her consistent record of success in achieving difficult objectives. Saiyan Stu. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Master Chief, I've dedicated the last 6 years of my life to preparing for this opportunity. I've sacrificed personal relationships, career alternatives, and financial opportunities to prove that I belong in special operations. You can't just transfer me based on assumptions about how I might perform in hypothetical situations. I can and I am, Thompson replied with the finality of military authority. The decision is effective at the end of this training cycle. Report to the Naval Intelligence Liaison Officer tomorrow morning for initial briefings on your new assignment. Emma felt time compressing around her like a physical force. Once she accepted the transfer, her opportunity to serve in special operations would be permanently closed. She'd spend the rest of her career analyzing reports written by the personnel who were actually conducting the missions she'd trained her entire adult life to participate in. "Master Chief, permission to speak freely," Emma said, her voice carrying the respectful defiance that had gotten her into trouble throughout her military career. Thompson nodded curtly, though his expression suggested he preferred to end the conversation rather than extend it through additional discussion. "This recommendation isn't based on my performance or my capabilities," Emma continued. "It's based on your assumption that I don't fit the psychological profile of what a special operations warrior should look like. You're transferring me because my success doesn't match your preconceptions about how success should be achieved. Rodriguez, that's enough." Thompson's voice carried a warning edge that Emma recognized as the boundary between professional discussion and insubordination. "I'm not finished, Master Chief." Emma's voice remained respectful but unwavering. "You mentioned the hostage rescue simulation. What you didn't mention was that my careful approach achieved every mission objective, while maintaining the moral authority that makes our operations legitimate in the eyes of international partners. You didn't mention that the intelligence gathered through my communication attempts provided strategic value that lasted long after the immediate tactical situation was resolved." Thompson's expression hardened as Emma continued speaking, but she could see uncertainty beginning to compete with his institutional assumptions about what made an effective special operations warrior. "The candidates who used immediate overwhelming force might have completed the exercise faster," Emma said, "but their methods created the kind of civilian casualties and international incidents that turned tactical victories into strategic disasters. My approach took longer, but it achieved sustainable success that serves American interests beyond the immediate mission parameters." Emma could see Thompson processing her words, weighing her arguments against the institutional pressure to maintain traditional standards for special operations selection. She'd learned to recognize this moment of hesitation in commanders who found themselves caught between acknowledging her competence and maintaining the comfortable assumptions that had guided their decision-making for decades. "Rodriguez, your methods might work in controlled training environments," Thompson said finally. "But special operations require the ability to make hard choices under extreme pressure. When American lives are at stake, we need warriors who can act decisively without second-guessing themselves, based on abstract ethical considerations." "Master Chief, what you call abstract ethical considerations are actually strategic necessities in modern warfare," Emma replied. "The conflicts we're fighting today require cultural understanding and tactical precision that can't be achieved through overwhelming force alone. The enemies we face use our civilian casualties as recruitment tools, and our procedural violations as justification for their own brutal methods." Thompson was quiet for several seconds, studying Emma's face as if trying to determine whether her arguments represented genuine strategic thinking or elaborate rationalization for what he saw as fundamental weakness. "Rodriguez, even if I accepted your analysis, I can't ignore the concerns raised by other instructors about your psychological readiness for the most demanding aspects of our training program," Thompson said. "The evaluations suggest you might struggle with the kind of sustained pressure that characterizes real special operations deployments." "What specific aspects of my performance suggest psychological weakness?" Emma asked. "My stress tolerance scores are consistently above average. My decision-making under pressure has been rated as excellent by every instructor, except those who disagree with my tactical approach. My leadership evaluations show that other candidates trust my judgment and follow my guidance during complex exercises." Thompson opened another section of Emma's file, revealing evaluations that she hadn't seen before. documents that apparently contained assessments of her suitability for the most classified aspects of special operations training. "Rodriguez, there's something you need to understand about the advanced phases of our program," Thompson said, his voice dropping to the confidential tone reserved for discussing sensitive information. "The psychological pressures involved in our most demanding training evolutions have broken experienced combat veterans. We're talking about challenges that test the absolute limits of human endurance and mental resilience." Emma felt her pulse quicken as she realized Thompson was referring to training programs she'd heard whispered about but never officially acknowledged. The legendary courses that separated even elite special operations personnel from the most capable individuals in the military. "What kind of challenges, Master Chief?" Emma asked, though she suspected the question would take the conversation into territory that her clearance level might not permit her to explore. Thompson closed the file and stared at Emma for several seconds, clearly weighing classified information against the need to justify his recommendation for her transfer. "Let me put it this way, Rodriguez. The advanced training evolutions we conduct here are designed to identify the small percentage of special operations personnel who can function effectively under the kind of prolonged stress that characterizes our most sensitive missions. These aren't physical challenges or tactical problems. They're psychological ordeals that reveal how individuals respond when every assumption they have about themselves and their capabilities is systematically destroyed." Emma understood that Thompson was describing training that went beyond conventional military instruction, programs designed to identify and develop the psychological resilience required for operations that couldn't be discussed in official channels. "Master Chief, are you saying that my transfer recommendation is based on the assumption that I couldn't handle advanced psychological training that I've never been permitted to attempt?" Emma asked. Thompson's expression shifted slightly, suggesting that Emma's question had identified the logical inconsistency in his reasoning. How could he assess her psychological limitations in training she'd never been allowed to participate in? "Rodriguez, the advanced programs I'm referring to have failure rates that exceed 90%, Thompson said. "Even experienced SEAL team members who volunteer for these courses typically wash out within the first few days. The psychological pressure is designed to be literally unbearable for most human beings." "Then let me try," Emma replied immediately. "If my psychological limitations are your primary concern, give me the opportunity to prove that your assumptions are incorrect." Thompson stared at Emma with an expression that combined surprise, concern, and what might have been reluctant admiration. She was volunteering for training that he'd just described as psychologically devastating, training that broken experienced warriors, training that was specifically designed to exceed human limitations. "Rodriguez, you don't understand what you're asking for," Thompson said. "The course I'm referring to isn't something you volunteer for casually. It's a 7-day psychological ordeal that has never been completed by any candidate in the program's history. We use it primarily as a research tool to study the limits of human mental resilience under extreme stress." Emma felt her breath catch as she realized the magnitude of what Thompson was describing. A training course so demanding that it had never been completed, used primarily for research rather than actual personnel development. The kind of impossible challenge that could either prove her capabilities beyond any doubt or destroy her military career completely. "Master Chief, if completing this course would eliminate questions about my psychological readiness for special operations, then I want to attempt it," Emma said, her voice steady despite the fear beginning to build in her chest. Thompson leaned back in his chair, clearly processing the implications of Emma's request. She was asking to attempt something that had defeated every previous candidate, something that existed at the absolute limits of human psychological endurance. "Rodriguez, even if I were willing to consider such a request, the course requires specific authorization from Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters. It's not something I can approve at my level of authority." "Then request the authorization," Emma replied. "Master Chief, you're recommending my transfer based on assumptions about psychological limitations that have never been tested under the conditions that concern you most. Give me the opportunity to prove that those assumptions are wrong." The silence in Thompson's office stretched for nearly a full minute as he weighed Emma's request against the institutional pressure to maintain established procedures for special operations selection. Outside the window, Emma could see other candidates continuing their training, unaware that their colleague was requesting permission to attempt something that had been deemed impossible for any human being to complete. "Rodriguez, what you're asking for isn't training," Thompson said finally. "It's a form of controlled psychological torture designed to identify the absolute limits of human mental resilience. Even if you are authorized to attempt it, the likelihood of permanent psychological damage is significant. Master Chief, the likelihood of spending my entire career wondering whether I could have succeeded if given the opportunity is 100%, Emma replied. I'd rather risk psychological damage than accept psychological defeat without ever testing my actual limitations. Thompson studied Emma's face for several more seconds, clearly recognizing the determination that had brought her through 6 years of military service, despite constant suggestions that she should accept less demanding assignments. All right, Rodriguez, Thompson said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone making a decision that violated his better judgment. I'll contact headquarters about authorizing your participation in the Advanced Psychological Resilience course. But I want you to understand that if this request is approved, there will be no backing out once the course begins. The psychological pressure is designed to be literally unbearable, and candidates who attempt to withdraw are typically suffering from stress-related conditions that require extended medical treatment. Emma felt her heart rate spike as she realized Thompson was actually considering her request. The impossible was becoming possible, though the price of failure would be higher than anything she'd risked before. I understand the risks, Master Chief, Emma said. But I also understand that some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. If this course exists to identify personnel capable of handling the most demanding psychological challenges in special operations, then attempting it is the only way to prove I belong in that category. Thompson nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he was authorizing something he expected to regret. Rodriguez, I'll submit the authorization request this afternoon, Thompson said. If headquarters approves your participation, you'll begin the course Monday morning. I strongly recommend you spend the weekend preparing yourself mentally for challenges that go beyond anything you've experienced in your military career. As Emma left Thompson's office, she realized that she'd just volunteered for something that might prove her psychological readiness for elite military service or destroy her mental health in the process. The impossible course that had never been completed awaited her, representing either the vindication of everything she'd worked toward or the end of her military aspirations. But for the first time since arriving at Naval Special Warfare Command, Emma felt the surge of hope that came with being given a real opportunity to prove her capabilities under the conditions that mattered most to her critics. The weekend passed in a blur of nervous energy and obsessive preparation that Emma knew was probably futile. How do you prepare for something designed to be psychologically unbearable? She spent Saturday morning in the base library researching every declassified document she could find about advanced military psychological training programs. The information was sparse and heavily redacted, but the fragments painted a picture of courses that pushed human mental resilience far beyond conventional understanding. Sunday evening brought the call she'd been simultaneously hoping for and dreading. Master Chief Thompson's voice carried an unusual tension as he delivered the news that would change everything about her military trajectory. Rodriguez, headquarters approved your request. Report to Building 3A at 0500 hours tomorrow morning. Bring only standard-issue clothing and personal hygiene items. Everything else will be provided. Thompson paused before continuing. Emma, I want you to know that I argued against this authorization. The psychological risks are significant, and your military career will be just as valuable in naval intelligence as it would be in special operations. Master Chief, I appreciate your concern, but this is something I need to do, Emma replied, surprised by how calm her voice sounded despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. If I'm going to spend the rest of my career being told I'm not psychologically suited for elite operations, I need to test that assumption under the most demanding conditions possible. Thompson's sigh was audible through the phone connection. Rodriguez, promise me something. If the psychological pressure becomes genuinely unbearable, Don't try to prove anything by pushing beyond your actual limitations. There's no shame in acknowledging when a challenge exceeds human capabilities. Emma appreciated Thompson's concern, but she also recognized the underlying assumption that she would inevitably fail. The same assumption that had followed her throughout her military career, always delivered with genuine care for her welfare and absolute certainty about her limitations. I'll make smart decisions based on actual conditions rather than theoretical fears, Master Chief. Thank you for supporting my request, even though you disagreed with it. After ending the call, Emma spent the evening writing letters she hoped she'd never need to send. Messages to her parents explaining why she'd chosen to attempt something so dangerous. Letters to her sister Carmen outlining her financial arrangements in case the psychological training resulted in permanent mental health issues. And a detailed account of her motivations for anyone who might need to understand why she'd voluntarily entered what amounted to controlled psychological torture. The act of writing those letters forced Emma to confront the genuine possibility that she might emerge from the course psychologically damaged in ways that would end her military career and potentially affect her civilian life permanently. The research she'd conducted suggested that some participants in advanced psychological training programs required months of therapy to recover from stress-related conditions that conventional military preparation couldn't prevent. But as Emma sealed the letters and placed them in her desk drawer, she realized that the alternative was even less acceptable, spending the rest of her career wondering whether she could have succeeded, accepting limitations that had never been tested under the conditions that supposedly revealed them, living with the knowledge that she'd chosen safety over the opportunity to prove her actual capabilities. Building 3A appeared in the pre-dawn darkness as a nondescript concrete structure that could have housed anything from administrative offices to classified research facilities. Emma arrived at 0455 hours, her standard-issue duffel bag containing only the items Thompson had specified. The building's windows were tinted dark enough to prevent any view of the interior, and the entrance was marked only with numbers that provided no indication of the activities conducted inside. Dr. Sarah Chen met Emma at the entrance, her civilian clothing and clipboard suggesting academic rather than military authority. Chen was a woman in her early 40s whose professional demeanor carried the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with situations that challenged conventional understanding of human psychology. Lieutenant Rodriguez, I'm Dr. Chen, the psychological researcher overseeing your participation in the Advanced Resilience Assessment course. Before we begin, I need to ensure you understand exactly what you volunteered for and confirm that your participation is entirely voluntary. Emma nodded, though her research had revealed almost nothing about what the course actually involved, beyond vague references to psychological pressure and mental resilience testing. Doctor, I understand that this course is designed to test psychological limitations under extreme stress, and I understand that no previous participant has completed the full 7-day program. Beyond that, I'm relying on your professional judgment to ensure that the experience remains within the bounds of ethical psychological research. Chen's expression suggested that Emma's answer demonstrated both appropriate seriousness and concerning naivete about what she was about to experience. Lieutenant, the course you're entering exists at the intersection of military training and psychological research. We've designed it to identify the specific mental characteristics that allow some individuals to function effectively under the kind of prolonged stress that characterizes the most demanding special operations assignments. Emma felt her pulse quicken as Chen continued, realizing that she was about to enter territory that had never been fully explored by military psychology. The 7-day program involves a series of psychological challenges that systematically test different aspects of mental resilience: sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, social isolation, cognitive overload, and decision-making under extreme pressure. Each day builds on the previous day's stress, creating cumulative psychological pressure that reveals how individuals respond when their normal coping mechanisms are no longer sufficient. Dr. Chen led Emma through a series of corridors that gradually transitioned from standard military architecture to something that resembled a combination of research facility and controlled environment. The walls were lined with monitoring equipment, and Emma could see observation windows that allowed researchers to study participants without being observed themselves. Lieutenant, I need you to understand that this course has never been completed because it's designed to exceed normal human psychological limitations. Previous participants have typically reached their breaking point somewhere between day 3 and day 5, at which point we immediately provide medical support and begin the recovery process. Emma paused in the corridor, suddenly confronting the full implications of what she'd volunteered for. She was about to enter a psychological ordeal that had been specifically designed to break her mental resilience, conducted by researchers who expected her to fail and were prepared to treat the psychological damage that failure would create. Dr. Chen, what happens if I do reach my breaking point? What kind of recovery process are we talking about? Chen's expression softened slightly, suggesting genuine concern for Emma's welfare, despite her role in administering what amounted to controlled psychological torture. Lieutenant, participants who reach their psychological limits typically require between 4 and 12 weeks of therapeutic support to recover from stress-related anxiety, depression, and what we might call learned helplessness. Most eventually return to full military duty, but some request transfer to less demanding assignments because the experience changes their perception of their own psychological capabilities. Emma felt her stomach tighten as she realized the full magnitude of what she was risking. Not just the immediate psychological damage from the course itself, but the long-term effects of learning that her mental resilience had limits that could be systematically exceeded through the right combination of stressors. Doctor, has anyone ever come close to completing the full 7 days? Chen checked her clipboard before responding, clearly reviewing data from previous participants. The longest anyone has lasted is 4 days and 18 hours. That participant was a veteran SEAL team leader with multiple combat deployments and extensive survival training. He eventually reached a state of psychological exhaustion that required immediate medical intervention and 6 weeks of therapeutic support before returning to active duty. Emma processed this information while staring at the observation windows that lined the corridor. Somewhere beyond those windows, researchers would be studying her psychological breakdown in real time, documenting the specific stressors that proved most effective at destroying her mental resilience. Dr. Chen, I need to ask you a direct question. In your professional opinion, what are the chances that I'll complete this course successfully? Chen was quiet for several seconds, clearly weighing her responsibility to provide honest assessment against her obligation to support Emma's voluntary participation in the research program. Lieutenant, based on your psychological evaluations and the performance of previous participants with similar profiles, I would estimate your chances of completion at less than 5%. The course is designed to exceed human limitations, and your psychological profile, while excellent for conventional military service, doesn't show the specific characteristics we've observed in participants who lasted longest. Emma felt the familiar cold sensation that accompanied professional assessments of her limitations, but this time the stakes were higher than career advancement or assignment preferences. Chen was essentially telling her that attempting the course would likely result in psychological damage for no meaningful benefit. What specific characteristics have you observed in participants who performed best? Emma asked, though she suspected the answer would reveal psychological traits she didn't possess. Chen consulted her notes before responding, clearly drawing on data from multiple participants over several years of research. The participants who lasted longest typically showed what we call compartmentalized emotional processing. They were able to separate their intellectual understanding of the situation from their emotional response to stress, maintaining analytical thinking even when experiencing severe psychological pressure. They also demonstrated what we might call adaptive paranoia, the ability to remain suspicious of their environment without becoming paralyzed by anxiety about threats they couldn't control. Emma recognized that Chen was describing psychological characteristics that her military evaluations had consistently identified as areas of relative weakness. Her tendency to process complex situations holistically, rather than compartmentalizing different aspects of decision-making, her preference for trust-based relationships over suspicious assessment of potential threats. Doctor, it sounds like you're describing psychological traits that are essentially opposite to my normal approach to stressful situations. Chen nodded reluctantly, Clearly uncomfortable with delivering an assessment that suggested Emma's participation in the course was likely to result in failure and psychological damage. Lieutenant, your psychological profile shows exceptional capabilities for leadership, strategic thinking, and ethical decision-making under pressure. But the specific mental characteristics that make you effective in conventional military roles might actually work against you in this particular kind of psychological challenge. Emma stared down the corridor toward what she assumed was the entrance to the actual course environment. Everything Chen was telling her suggested that she was about to voluntarily enter a situation designed to exploit her psychological weaknesses, while providing no opportunity to utilize her demonstrated strengths. Dr. Chen, given what you've told me about my chances of success and the risks involved, would you recommend that I withdraw from the course before it begins? Chen's expression reflected the ethical complexity of her position, as both a researcher interested in studying psychological limits and a medical professional responsible for participant welfare. Lieutenant, I can't make that recommendation for you. What I can tell you is that the knowledge you'll gain about your own psychological capabilities might be valuable regardless of whether you complete the full course. Understanding your actual mental limitations under extreme stress could make you more effective in conventional military roles, even if it eliminates special operations as a career option. Emma realized that Chen was offering her a face-saving alternative to the all-or-nothing challenge she'd originally envisioned. She could participate in the course long enough to gain self-knowledge about her psychological resilience without necessarily risking the severe mental health consequences that complete failure might create. But as Emma considered this option, she recognized that partial participation would still leave unanswered the fundamental question that had brought her to this point: whether her psychological limitations were real constraints that disqualified her from elite military service, or institutional assumptions that had never been tested under the conditions that supposedly revealed them. Dr. Chen, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I need to attempt the full course. If I'm going to accept limitations on my military career based on psychological assessments, those assessments need to be based on my actual performance under the most demanding conditions possible. Chen nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she was authorizing something she expected to regret. Lieutenant, once you enter the course environment, the psychological pressure will build systematically over 7 days. You'll have opportunities to withdraw at any point, but the decision-making process itself becomes part of the psychological challenge. The stress is designed to impair your judgment about your own capabilities and limitations. Emma felt her heart rate increase as she realized that even the decision to continue or withdraw would be compromised by the psychological manipulation built into the course design. She would be making crucial choices about her own welfare while her ability to assess her situation was being systematically degraded. Doctor, I understand the risks, but I also understand that this is my only opportunity to test my psychological capabilities under the conditions that my critics consider most relevant to special operations effectiveness. Chen led Emma to a final briefing room where she reviewed the medical monitoring procedures that would track her psychological state throughout the course. Heart rate variability, stress hormone levels, sleep patterns, cognitive function assessments, and behavioral indicators that would allow researchers to intervene if her psychological condition became genuinely dangerous. Lieutenant, the monitoring equipment will allow us to track your psychological state in real time, but the decision about when to provide medical intervention involves judgment calls about the difference between severe stress and dangerous psychological breakdown. We err on the side of participant safety, which means we might intervene before you've truly reached your limits. Emma understood that Chen was explaining another variable that could affect her chances of completing the course. Even if she possessed the psychological resilience to continue, the researchers might terminate her participation based on medical indicators that suggested dangerous stress levels. Dr. Chen, I need you to understand something. This course represents my only opportunity to prove that my psychological capabilities have been systematically underestimated throughout my military career. If you're going to err on the side of caution, please make sure that caution is based on genuine medical necessity rather than assumptions about my limitations. Chen's expression suggested she recognized the deeper implications of Emma's request. She wasn't just asking for permission to risk psychological damage. She was asking to be held to the same standards as male participants who might be given more opportunities to demonstrate their resilience before medical intervention was considered necessary. Lieutenant Rodriguez, I want you to know that your participation in this research is voluntary and valuable, regardless of the outcome. The data we gather will contribute to better understanding of psychological resilience under extreme stress, and that knowledge will benefit future military personnel regardless of whether you personally complete the full course. Emma appreciated Chen's attempt to frame potential failure in positive terms, but she also recognized the underlying assumption that failure was the most likely outcome. The same assumption that had followed her throughout her military career, always delivered with genuine concern for her welfare and absolute certainty about her limitations. Doctor, I understand that you expect me to fail, and I understand that failure is statistically the most likely outcome. But I need you to give me every possible opportunity to prove that statistical probability doesn't determine individual capability. Chen nodded and led Emma toward the entrance to the actual course environment. As they walked, Emma realized that she was about to enter 7 days of psychological challenges that had been specifically designed to exceed her mental resilience, administered by researchers who expected her to fail, monitored by equipment that might terminate her participation based on stress indicators rather than her actual decision to continue. Everything about the situation suggested that she was walking into a carefully constructed trap that would prove her psychological limitations while providing scientific justification for the career restrictions that had always frustrated her. But as Emma approached the entrance to the course environment, she felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through 6 years of being told she wasn't suitable for the most demanding military assignments. For the first time in her career, she would have the opportunity to test her psychological capabilities under the exact conditions that her critics considered most revealing. The outcome would either vindicate everything she'd believed about her own potential or provide definitive proof that her limitations were real and her aspirations unrealistic. Either way, she would finally know the truth about her psychological capabilities rather than accepting other people's assumptions about her limitations. The course environment revealed itself as Emma stepped through the entrance, and her first impression was how deceptively ordinary everything appeared. The initial room resembled a standard military briefing facility, complete with fluorescent lighting, gray walls, and institutional furniture that could have been found at any training command. Dr. Chen had warned her that the psychological pressure would build systematically, but nothing in the immediate environment suggested the kind of extreme stress that had broken experienced combat veterans. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Walsh waited in the center of the room, her crisp Navy uniform displaying the ribbon rack of someone who'd served in multiple combat zones. Walsh was a woman in her late 30s, whose professional demeanor carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions about personnel who operated at the limits of human capability. Her presence immediately elevated the situation from academic research to military evaluation. Lieutenant Rodriguez, I'm Commander Walsh, the Senior Military Observer, for your participation in this assessment course. Before we begin, I want you to understand that everything you experience over the next 7 days will be documented and analyzed for its relevance to Special Operations selection criteria. Emma felt her stomach tighten as she realized that her performance would be evaluated not just by researchers interested in psychological limits, but by military personnel who would use the results to make definitive judgments about her suitability for elite operations. The course wasn't just a research study, it was an extended evaluation that would determine her military future. Commander, I understand that my performance will be assessed according to standards relevant to special operations effectiveness. I am prepared to demonstrate my psychological capabilities under whatever conditions the course requires. Walsh's expression suggested professional skepticism about Emma's chances of success, though her tone remained carefully neutral as she explained the evaluation criteria that would determine whether Emma's participation was considered successful. Lieutenant, the assessment will focus on your ability to maintain effective decision-making under progressively severe psychological stress. We're not looking for perfect performance. We're looking for evidence that you can continue functioning at acceptable levels when your normal coping mechanisms are no longer sufficient. Dr. Chen activated a wall-mounted monitor that displayed what appeared to be a timeline, showing 7 days divided into phases marked with different colors. Each phase was labeled with terms that provided no specific information about the challenges involved: environmental adaptation, cognitive stress testing, social isolation protocols, decision-making under pressure, resource scarcity management, authority challenge scenarios, and final integration assessment. Lieutenant Rodriguez, the course is designed to test different aspects of psychological resilience in a specific sequence that builds cumulative stress over time. Each phase will introduce new challenges while maintaining the pressure from previous phases, creating psychological conditions that simulate the kind of prolonged stress experienced during the most demanding special operations deployments. Emma studied the timeline, trying to extract meaningful information from the vague phase descriptions. Her military training had taught her to anticipate challenges based on available intelligence, but the course designers had clearly structured the program to prevent participants from developing specific preparation strategies. Dr. Chen, can you provide more detailed information about what each phase will involve? I understand that some aspects need to remain unknown, but general parameters would help me understand what kinds of psychological resources I should prioritize during the early phases. Chen exchanged a glance with Commander Walsh before responding, clearly weighing the value of preparation against the research requirement that participants enter each phase without specific expectations about the challenges they would face. Lieutenant, I can tell you that the course is designed to test your psychological adaptability rather than your ability to prepare for known challenges. The specific nature of each phase is kept confidential because we need to assess how you respond to unexpected stressors, rather than how well you can prepare for anticipated difficulties. Emma recognized that she was entering a psychological assessment designed to prevent the kind of strategic planning that had always been one of her strongest military capabilities. Instead of analyzing challenges and developing systematic approaches to overcome them, she would be forced to rely on immediate psychological responses to situations she couldn't anticipate or prepare for. Commander Walsh activated another monitor that displayed what appeared to be biographical information about previous participants in the course. Emma could see data about their military backgrounds, psychological profiles, and performance summaries, though the specific details were partially redacted to protect individual privacy. Lieutenant, I want you to understand something about the people who've attempted this course before you. They include veteran special operations personnel with extensive combat experience, military psychologists who specialize in stress management, and individuals who specifically volunteered because they believed their psychological training would give them advantages in this kind of assessment. Emma studied the performance data, noting that even participants with the most impressive military credentials and specialized psychological training had failed to complete the full 7-day course. The longest duration achieved by any participant was 4 days and 18 hours, accomplished by someone whose redacted biography suggested extraordinary qualifications for psychological resilience. Commander, what can you tell me about the factors that led to failure in previous participants? Understanding the common breakdown patterns might help me develop strategies to maintain psychological effectiveness longer. Walsh's expression suggested that Emma's question demonstrated both appropriate tactical thinking and fundamental misunderstanding of what the course was designed to test. Lieutenant, the challenge isn't developing strategies to overcome known obstacles. The challenge is maintaining psychological effectiveness when your strategic planning capabilities are systematically compromised by stress, fatigue, and environmental manipulation that exceeds your ability to analyze and adapt. Dr. Chen began connecting monitoring equipment to Emma's uniform, explaining that the sensors would track physiological indicators of stress while allowing researchers to intervene if her psychological condition became medically dangerous. The equipment included heart rate monitors, skin conductance sensors, and what appeared to be neurological monitoring devices that could assess her cognitive function in real time. Lieutenant, the monitoring equipment will provide us with objective data about your psychological state, but it will also create an additional layer of stress because you'll know that your every response is being observed and analyzed. This observation effect is itself part of the psychological challenge, since special operations personnel must maintain effectiveness while knowing that their performance is being continuously evaluated. Emma realized that the monitoring equipment created a paradox that would complicate her psychological responses throughout the course. She needed to maintain natural reactions to stressful situations, while knowing that artificial behavior designed to impress observers would likely be detected by the sophisticated monitoring systems. Dr. Chen, how do I balance the need to respond authentically to psychological stressors with the knowledge that my responses are being continuously evaluated for their relevance to military effectiveness? Chen's expression suggested that Emma had identified one of the fundamental challenges built into the course design, a psychological double-bind that created additional stress while testing participants' ability to function effectively under observation. Lieutenant, that question demonstrates exactly the kind of analytical thinking that will either help you succeed or create additional psychological pressure that contributes to breakdown. The course is designed to test whether you can maintain effectiveness while managing the metacognitive stress of knowing your psychological responses are being studied. Commander Walsh reviewed a checklist that appeared to contain final authorization procedures for beginning Emma's participation in the course. Each item required confirmation that Emma understood specific aspects of what she was about to experience and accepted responsibility for her voluntary participation despite the documented risks. Lieutenant Rodriguez, I need verbal confirmation that you understand this assessment course has never been completed by any previous participant, that the psychological pressure is designed to exceed normal human limitations, and that your participation may result in stress-related conditions requiring extended medical treatment. Emma felt the weight of the moment as she realized that her next words would commit her to 7 days of psychological challenges that had defeated every previous participant, including individuals with more extensive military experience and specialized training in stress management. Commander Walsh, I understand the risks and I understand that no previous participant has completed the full course. I also understand that accepting limitations on my military career without testing those limitations under the most demanding conditions available would be a different kind of failure that I'm not willing to accept. Walsh nodded and activated what appeared to be a recording system that would document Emma's performance throughout the course for later analysis by military personnel responsible for special operations selection decisions. Lieutenant, the course begins now. Phase 1 involves environmental adaptation challenges designed to test your psychological flexibility when normal environmental cues are systematically altered. You will be placed in controlled environments where your sensory inputs, spatial orientation, and temporal awareness will be manipulated to create disorientation that simulates the kind of psychological pressure experienced during extended operations in unfamiliar territory. Emma felt her heart rate increase as the room's lighting suddenly shifted to a reddish tone that made depth perception difficult and color discrimination nearly impossible. The temperature began fluctuating in ways that made it impossible to determine whether the environment was becoming warmer or cooler, and sounds that seemed to come from random directions created an acoustic landscape that prevented her from maintaining consistent spatial orientation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Dr. Chen's voice came through speakers built into the walls, though the audio quality was distorted enough to require concentrated attention to understand her words clearly. Lieutenant Rodriguez, your first challenge is to maintain accurate time awareness while performing basic cognitive tasks in an environment designed to disrupt your normal sensory processing. You have access to materials for completing assigned tasks, but the environmental conditions will make standard approaches to organization and time management ineffective. Emma looked around the room and noticed that tables, chairs, and work materials had been arranged in configurations that seemed logical but became confusing when she tried to navigate between them. The furniture appeared to be standard military issue, but the spatial relationships created optical illusions that made distance and position difficult to judge accurately. A series of documents appeared on the main table, each containing what looked like military intelligence reports that required analysis and summary. Under normal conditions, Emma could have completed the work quickly using systematic approaches she'd developed during her intelligence training. But the environmental manipulations made it difficult to maintain consistent focus on the documents while tracking time passage and maintaining awareness of her spatial position in the room. The lighting continued shifting between different colors and intensities, creating visual conditions that made reading challenging and forced her to continuously adapt her approach to processing written information. The temperature fluctuations required constant adjustments to her physical comfort, while trying to maintain cognitive focus on analytical tasks that required sustained attention to detail. Emma attempted to establish a systematic approach to completing the assigned work, but the environmental conditions made her normal organizational strategies ineffective. Documents that she placed in specific locations seemed to move when she looked away, though she knew this was likely the result of spatial disorientation rather than actual manipulation of the materials. The audio distortions created a constant background stress that required mental energy to filter out while maintaining focus on cognitive tasks. Emma found herself expending psychological resources on basic environmental navigation that would normally be available for analytical thinking and strategic planning. After what felt like several hours, though the lack of reliable time cues made duration estimates impossible, Emma realized that the environmental challenges were succeeding in creating exactly the kind of psychological pressure Dr. Chen had described. Her normal approaches to problem-solving were becoming less effective, and she was beginning to experience the kind of mental fatigue that could impair judgment about her own capabilities. Dr. Chen's distorted voice returned through the speakers, announcing that Phase 1 was complete and that Emma's performance had been recorded for analysis. The environmental conditions returned to normal lighting and temperature, though Emma noticed that the relief she felt from these changes was disproportionate to the actual severity of the stressors she'd experienced. Lieutenant Rodriguez, Phase 1 assessment indicates that you maintained adequate cognitive function under moderate environmental stress, though your efficiency decreased significantly compared to baseline performance. Phase 2 will introduce social isolation protocols designed to test your psychological resilience when normal human interaction and emotional support systems are removed. Emma realized that the course was designed to build psychological pressure systematically, with each phase creating new challenges while maintaining the stress accumulated from previous phases. The environmental disorientation from Phase 1 would continue affecting her psychological state, while she dealt with whatever social isolation challenges were introduced in Phase 2. Commander Walsh reappeared in the room, though her demeanor had shifted subtly in ways that Emma couldn't immediately identify. Her professional courtesy remained intact, but there was something in her expression that suggested distance or disapproval that hadn't been present during the initial briefing. Lieutenant Rodriguez, Phase 2, requires you to continue cognitive tasks, while receiving feedback and guidance from supervisory personnel, who will evaluate your performance according to standards that are not fully explained. The social dynamics involved in this phase simulate the kind of ambiguous authority relationships that characterize special operations environments where clear command structures may not exist. Emma felt a chill of recognition as she realized that Phase 2 was designed to exploit her documented sensitivity to interpersonal dynamics and her tendency to seek collaborative approaches to problem-solving. By removing clear social cues and introducing ambiguous authority relationships, the course would test her ability to function effectively when her preferred communication styles were no longer viable. The psychological pressure was building exactly as Dr. Chen had warned, and Emma was beginning to understand why no previous participant had completed the full 7-day course. Each phase was designed to target different aspects of psychological resilience, while maintaining cumulative stress that would eventually exceed any individual's ability to compensate. But as Emma prepared to enter Phase 2, she also recognized that she was gaining valuable information about her own psychological responses under extreme stress. The knowledge might prove useful for special operations effectiveness, regardless of whether she completed the full course, and it was certainly more comprehensive than any previous assessment of her psychological capabilities under demanding conditions. The question was whether this knowledge would come at the cost of psychological damage that would affect her military effectiveness permanently, or whether she possessed mental resilience that had never been properly tested because no one had ever created conditions demanding enough to reveal her actual limitations. Phase 2 began with Commander Walsh's transformation into someone Emma barely recognized. The professional courtesy that had characterized their earlier interactions vanished, replaced by cold evaluation that made every exchange feel like a test Emma was failing. Walsh's questions came with implied criticism, her feedback carried undertones of disappointment, and her general demeanor suggested that Emma's performance was confirming negative expectations rather than demonstrating competence. Lieutenant Rodriguez, your completion time for the Phase 1 analytical tasks was 43% longer than the average achieved by previous participants. Your accuracy remained within acceptable parameters, but your efficiency suggests difficulty adapting to environmental stressors that special operations personnel encounter routinely during extended deployments. Emma felt the familiar sting of criticism that seemed designed to undermine confidence rather than provide constructive feedback. But this time, she recognized that the criticism itself was part of the psychological challenge, designed to test her ability to maintain effectiveness when receiving negative evaluation from authority figures whose approval she needed for career advancement. Commander, I understand that my performance wasn't optimal, but I maintained accuracy while adapting to environmental conditions I'd never experienced before. In real operational contexts, I would have opportunities to develop familiarity with environmental challenges through training and preparation that weren't available during Phase 1. Walsh's expression hardened at Emma's response, suggesting that attempts to explain or justify performance were being interpreted as defensiveness that indicated psychological weakness under pressure. Lieutenant, special operations personnel don't get opportunities to practice in controlled environments before facing life-threatening challenges. The ability to maintain peak effectiveness during initial exposure to extreme stressors is exactly what we're testing here, and your need to rationalize suboptimal performance suggests psychological limitations that could compromise mission success. Emma recognized that she was caught in a psychological trap where any response would be interpreted negatively. Accepting criticism without comment would suggest passive resignation that indicated weakness, while attempting to provide context for her performance would be viewed as defensiveness that revealed inability to handle legitimate evaluation. The cognitive tasks assigned during Phase 2 were similar to those from Phase 1, but now Emma had to complete them while receiving constant evaluation from Walsh and Dr. Chen, whose feedback created additional psychological pressure that competed with the mental resources required for analytical thinking. Every decision was questioned, every approach was critiqued, and every result was compared unfavorably to some unstated standard of excellence. Dr. Chen's voice carried clinical detachment as she provided running commentary on Emma's psychological responses, analyzing her behavior in real time, while treating her more like a research subject than a military officer deserving professional respect. Subject demonstrates increased stress indicators when receiving negative feedback, suggesting emotional regulation difficulties that could impair decision-making effectiveness during challenging operational scenarios. Note elevated heart rate and decreased task efficiency when supervisory personnel expressed dissatisfaction with performance quality. Emma realized that being referred to as quote-quote subject rather than by name or rank was itself part of the psychological manipulation, designed to create depersonalization that would make her feel like an object of study rather than a respected professional. The constant clinical analysis of her responses created self-consciousness that interfered with natural psychological processes, while providing researchers with data about how observation affected her performance. The social isolation aspect of Phase 2 became more apparent as hours passed without any normal human interaction. Walsh and Chen spoke to Emma only to provide criticism or deliver instructions, never engaging in the kind of casual conversation that maintains psychological connection between people working together. The absence of positive social reinforcement created an emotional vacuum that required additional psychological resources to manage while completing assigned cognitive tasks. Emma found herself craving basic acknowledgement of her humanity from the researchers who monitored her every response, while treating her like a specimen whose psychological breakdown was expected and scientifically valuable. The isolation wasn't physical separation from other people, it was emotional disconnection that made her feel fundamentally alone, despite being constantly observed. Commander Walsh introduced new complications by providing contradictory instructions that made it impossible to complete tasks correctly according to all stated requirements. Emma would receive directions to prioritize accuracy over speed, then be criticized for taking too long to complete assignments. She would be told to demonstrate independent thinking, then questioned for not following established procedures more closely. Lieutenant Rodriguez, your approach to analytical prioritization shows concerning inconsistency. During the first task sequence, you emphasized thoroughness over efficiency, but during the second sequence, you prioritized completion time over comprehensive analysis. Special operations require personnel who can maintain consistent decision-making approaches regardless of external pressures. Emma felt frustration building as she realized that the contradictory instructions were designed to create a situation where success was impossible by any consistent standard. No matter what approach she chose, there would be evidence that she should have chosen differently, creating psychological pressure that could undermine her confidence in her own judgment. Commander Walsh, the instructions I received for the first task sequence emphasized accuracy as the primary evaluation criterion, while the instructions for the second sequence emphasized completion time. I adjusted my approach based on the stated priorities for each task, which seems consistent with adaptive problem-solving rather than inconsistent decision-making. Walsh's response carried the tone of someone explaining obvious concepts to someone too limited to understand them independently. Lieutenant, special operations personnel must demonstrate the judgment to determine appropriate priorities based on situational analysis, rather than depending on explicit instructions. Your need for clear guidance about task priorities suggests difficulty with autonomous decision-making that could prove problematic during independent operations where supervisory input isn't available. Emma recognized that she was experiencing exactly the kind of psychological manipulation that had been used throughout her military career to suggest that her strengths were actually weaknesses. Her preference for clear communication and systematic analysis was being reframed as dependence on external guidance rather than professional competence in complex situations. Dr. Chen introduced additional monitoring equipment that required Emma to wear headphones that delivered random audio interruptions while she attempted to concentrate on written analysis tasks. The interruptions included voice recordings that demanded immediate responses to questions unrelated to her assigned work, creating cognitive interference that made sustained attention extremely difficult. The audio interruptions were calibrated to occur at intervals that prevented Emma from developing adaptation strategies, ensuring that each interruption required full attention while disrupting whatever analytical progress she had achieved on her primary tasks. The psychological effect was similar to trying to maintain complex reasoning while being repeatedly startled by unexpected stimuli. Subject shows significant performance degradation when cognitive attention is divided between primary analytical tasks and secondary response requirements. Note increased error rates and decreased completion efficiency when auditory interruptions require immediate attention shifts. Emma realized that the monitoring commentary itself had become another psychological stressor, creating self-consciousness about her responses while providing clinical interpretation of her performance that suggested pathological rather than normal psychological reactions to artificial stress conditions. The combination of environmental manipulation, social isolation, contradictory instructions, constant negative evaluation, and cognitive interference was creating cumulative psychological pressure that exceeded anything Emma had experienced during her military career. She could feel her normal problem-solving approaches becoming less effective as mental resources were consumed by managing stressors that had no practical solutions. Commander Walsh announced that Phase 2 evaluation was complete, but that the social isolation protocols would continue throughout the remaining phases of the course. Emma would receive task assignments and performance feedback, but normal human interaction and emotional support would remain unavailable for the duration of her participation. Lieutenant Rodriguez, Phase 2 assessment indicates significant difficulties with autonomous decision-making under evaluative pressure and reduced effectiveness when normal supervisory support structures are unavailable. These limitations could prove problematic during special operations deployments, where personnel must maintain peak performance while operating independently in hostile environments. Emma felt the weight of Walsh's assessment while recognizing that it was designed to create psychological pressure rather than provide objective evaluation of her capabilities under normal operational conditions. The artificial stressors built into the course were specifically chosen to target her psychological vulnerabilities while preventing her from utilizing her demonstrated strengths. But she also recognized that special operations personnel did face psychological challenges that exceeded those encountered in conventional military roles, and that her ability to function effectively under extreme stress was legitimately relevant to her suitability for elite assignments. The question was whether the course was testing realistic psychological demands or creating artificial conditions that had no relationship to actual operational requirements. Dr. Chen announced that Phase 3 would introduce decision-making challenges under severe time pressure, where incorrect choices would result in negative consequences that created additional stress for subsequent phases. Emma would be required to make complex judgments with insufficient information, while knowing that mistakes would compound the psychological pressure she was already experiencing. The transition to Phase 3 occurred without any break in the monitoring or evaluation procedures, ensuring that Emma carried the accumulated stress from previous phases into new challenges that would test different aspects of her psychological resilience. She could feel her mental fatigue increasing, while her confidence in her own judgment was being systematically undermined by the constant negative feedback. As Phase 3 began, Emma realized that she was approaching the psychological territory where previous participants had typically reached their breaking points. The combination of environmental stress, social isolation, and evaluative pressure was creating mental conditions that exceeded her previous experience with challenging situations. But she also recognized that she had maintained cognitive function and analytical capability despite the artificial stressors, suggesting that her psychological resilience might be greater than her evaluators assumed. The question was whether she could continue functioning effectively as the psychological pressure increased, or whether she would experience the kind of breakdown that had ended previous participants' attempts to complete the course. Here, the monitoring equipment showed elevated stress indicators, but Emma's subjective experience suggested that she retained the mental clarity necessary for effective decision-making under pressure. The gap between objective measurements of psychological stress and her actual cognitive capabilities might indicate that the researchers' intervention criteria were based on assumptions about stress tolerance that didn't account for individual variations in psychological resilience. Emma prepared to enter Phase 3 with the knowledge that she was being tested at the limits of documented human psychological endurance, but also with growing confidence that her mental capabilities had been systematically underestimated throughout her military career. The impossible course was proving difficult but not psychologically devastating, suggesting that her critics' assumptions about her limitations might be less accurate than they had always claimed. The decision-making challenges that defined Phase 3 would test whether her analytical capabilities could function effectively under conditions that had broken experienced combat veterans, providing definitive information about whether her psychological resilience was adequate for the most demanding military assignments. For the first time since beginning the course, Emma felt cautiously optimistic about her chances of completing challenges that everyone expected to exceed her capabilities. The psychological pressure was severe, but her fundamental cognitive processes remained intact, despite the artificial stressors designed to disrupt them. Whether this optimism was justified or represented the kind of impaired self-assessment that Dr. Chen had warned about would be revealed by her performance during the decision-making challenges that lay ahead. Phase 3 materialized as a sterile command center filled with multiple screens displaying what appeared to be real-time intelligence data from active military operations. Emma found herself seated at a control station where green and red indicators flashed continuously, creating an atmosphere of urgent decision-making that demanded immediate responses to rapidly changing tactical situations. The setup was designed to simulate the kind of high-pressure command environment where split-second judgments could determine whether military personnel lived or died. Dr. Chen's voice echoed through the speakers with clinical precision, explaining that Emma would face a series of tactical scenarios requiring immediate decisions based on incomplete information. Each choice would trigger consequences that affected subsequent scenarios, creating cascading complexity where early mistakes would compound throughout the remaining challenges. Lieutenant Rodriguez, you are now assuming command responsibility for multiple ongoing operations where American personnel are at risk. The information available to you is limited and potentially inaccurate, but decisions cannot be delayed while additional intelligence is gathered. Your choices will determine mission outcomes and casualty rates for scenarios based on actual special operations challenges. Emma felt her pulse accelerate as she realized that the decisions she made would feel psychologically real even though the scenarios were simulated. The emotional weight of believing that her judgments affected American lives would create genuine psychological pressure regardless of whether actual personnel were at risk. The first scenario appeared on the central screen, a special operations team pinned down by enemy fire with wounded personnel requiring immediate medical evacuation. 3 extraction options were available, each carrying different risks for the rescue team and different probabilities of successfully evacuating the wounded soldiers. Emma had 30 seconds to choose. Her analytical training suggested requesting additional intelligence about enemy positions and extraction route security, but the countdown timer eliminated any possibility of gathering more information. She selected the extraction option that balanced crew safety against evacuation speed, knowing that any choice could be justified or criticized depending on the eventual outcome. Here's Stowe says, the scenario resolved with partial success. The wounded personnel were evacuated, but the rescue helicopter sustained damage that would affect its availability for subsequent missions. Emma realized that her decision had created consequences that would influence future scenarios in ways she couldn't predict or prepare for. Commander Walsh's voice carried disapproval as she provided immediate feedback on Emma's decision-making process, analyzing her choice in terms that suggested better alternatives had been obvious to more experienced personnel. Lieutenant Rodriguez, your selection prioritized equipment preservation over personnel safety, resulting in delayed medical treatment that could have been avoided through more aggressive extraction procedures. Special operations personnel expect commanders to accept equipment risks when American lives are at stake. Emma felt the familiar frustration of having her careful reasoning reinterpreted as evidence of misplaced priorities, but she also recognized that the criticism was designed to create psychological pressure that would affect her approach to subsequent decisions. The evaluation itself was part of the challenge, testing whether she could maintain effective judgment while receiving negative feedback about her performance. The second scenario involved a hostage rescue operation where intelligence suggested that immediate assault would save most hostages but result in higher casualties among the rescue team, while delayed action would allow for better tactical preparation but might result in hostage executions. The 30-second decision window prevented comprehensive analysis of the competing risks. Emma chose immediate assault based on her assessment that hostage preservation was the primary mission objective, but the scenario outcome included higher rescue team casualties than the alternative approach would have produced. The psychological impact of believing that her decision had resulted in American deaths created genuine emotional stress despite her intellectual understanding that the scenarios were simulated. Dr. Chen's monitoring commentary provided clinical analysis of Emma's psychological responses to decision-making under pressure, treating her emotional reactions to simulated casualties as data points rather than normal human responses to tragic outcomes. Subject demonstrates elevated stress responses when tactical decisions result in friendly casualties, indicating potential difficulties with command responsibilities that require accepting personnel losses to achieve strategic objectives. Note increased decision latency and decreased confidence indicators following scenarios with negative outcomes. Emma realized that her normal emotional responses to difficult decisions were being interpreted as psychological weaknesses that could disqualify her from command responsibilities. The clinical analysis of her humanity created additional psychological pressure while suggesting that effective military leadership required emotional detachment that she might not possess. The scenarios continued with relentless pace, each presenting moral and tactical dilemmas that required immediate resolution despite incomplete information and competing priorities. Emma faced decisions about resource allocation during humanitarian crises, rules of engagement in situations involving civilian populations, and operational priorities when multiple missions competed for limited assets. The cumulative psychological weight of making life-and-death decisions under severe time pressure began affecting Emma's cognitive processes in ways that the monitoring equipment documented with scientific precision. Her decision-making speed decreased as she tried to process increasingly complex scenarios, and her confidence in her choices diminished as the consequences of previous decisions created additional complications. Commander Walsh introduced a new element by providing contradictory intelligence updates that arrived after Emma had already committed to specific courses of action. She would receive information suggesting that her decisions were based on faulty assumptions, but the scenarios continued evolving based on her original choices regardless of whether subsequent intelligence indicated better alternatives. Lieutenant Rodriguez, updated intelligence indicates that the hostage rescue scenario involved friendly personnel rather than enemy combatants. Your decision to authorize immediate assault resulted in casualties among American Special Operations personnel who were conducting a separate mission in the same area. Emma felt the psychological impact of learning that her careful decision-making had been based on incorrect information that led to tragic outcomes she couldn't have prevented. The revelation created retroactive guilt about decisions that had seemed reasonable based on available intelligence, while demonstrating how incomplete information could make any choice potentially catastrophic. The time pressure continued eliminating opportunities for thorough analysis, forcing Emma to make crucial judgments based on intuitive assessments rather than systematic evaluation of alternatives. She found herself developing decision-making shortcuts that prioritized speed over comprehensiveness, knowing that delayed choices would be criticized as evidence of indecisiveness under pressure. Dr. Chen announced that the decision-making scenarios would continue for 6 hours, with breaks only for basic physiological needs that couldn't be deferred without compromising Emma's health. The psychological pressure would build continuously as previous decisions created consequences that affected subsequent scenarios, testing her ability to maintain effective judgment while managing cumulative stress from multiple sources. Emma realized that she was entering psychological territory that exceeded her previous experience with high-pressure decision-making. The combination of time pressure, incomplete information, moral complexity, and constant evaluation was creating mental conditions that challenged her fundamental approaches to problem-solving and leadership. The monitoring equipment showed stress indicators that approached the levels where previous participants had typically requested termination of their course participation. But Emma's subjective experience suggested that her cognitive capabilities remained functional despite the artificial stressors, indicating possible discrepancies between physiological measurements and actual psychological resilience. After 3 hours of continuous decision-making scenarios, Emma noticed that her analytical processes were adapting to the extreme conditions rather than deteriorating completely. She was developing intuitive approaches to rapid assessment that maintained reasonable accuracy despite the severe time constraints and information limitations. The adaptation surprised both Emma and her observers, who had expected progressive degradation in decision-making quality as psychological pressure accumulated. Instead, her performance showed signs of improvement as she learned to function effectively within the artificial constraints imposed by the course design. Commander Walsh's evaluation commentary began reflecting uncertainty about Emma's psychological responses, suggesting that her adaptation to extreme stress was unexpected based on the performance patterns typically observed in previous participants. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Lieutenant Rodriguez demonstrates unusual resilience in maintaining decision-making effectiveness under sustained psychological pressure. Her performance metrics show stabilization rather than the progressive deterioration typically observed when participants approach psychological limits. Emma felt cautious optimism as she realized that her psychological responses to extreme stress might be more effective than anyone had anticipated. The impossible course was proving challenging, but not psychologically devastating, suggesting that her mental resilience had been systematically underestimated by evaluators who based their assessments on assumptions about her limitations. Dr. Chen introduced additional complications by providing false information mixed randomly with accurate intelligence, forcing Emma to make decisions while unsure whether her information sources were reliable. The uncertainty created an additional layer of psychological pressure while testing her ability to function effectively when fundamental assumptions about situational awareness could be incorrect. Emma found herself developing risk assessment strategies that accounted for information uncertainty while maintaining decision-making speed adequate for the artificial time constraints. Her approaches balanced careful analysis against the need for rapid resolution, creating hybrid methods that hadn't been part of her original military training. The fourth hour brought scenarios involving nuclear weapons security, terrorist attacks against civilian populations, and diplomatic crises, where military intervention could trigger international conflicts. The stakes escalated beyond conventional military operations into global security challenges where incorrect decisions could affect millions of people. Emma realized that the scenarios were designed to test her psychological responses to ultimate responsibility rather than her technical competence in specific military skills. The course was evaluating whether she could maintain effective judgment when the consequences of her decisions extended beyond military personnel to civilian populations and international stability. The psychological weight of believing that her choices affected global security created stress that exceeded anything in her previous military experience. But she also recognized that special operations personnel did face situations where their decisions carried consequences far beyond immediate tactical objectives, making the psychological pressure relevant to actual operational requirements. As the fifth hour began, Emma noticed that her stress responses had stabilized at levels that allowed sustained cognitive function, despite the continued psychological pressure. Her adaptation to extreme conditions was providing information about her mental resilience that had never been tested under comparable circumstances. The monitoring equipment showed persistent elevated stress indicators, but Emma's actual decision-making capability remained within acceptable parameters for effective military command. The gap between physiological measurements and cognitive performance suggested that intervention criteria based solely on stress indicators might not accurately reflect individual psychological resilience. Commander Walsh announced that Phase 3 evaluation was approaching completion, but that the decision-making pressure would continue throughout the remaining phases of the course. Emma would face additional psychological challenges while maintaining command responsibilities that required sustained attention to complex tactical situations. Emma prepared for Phase 4 with growing confidence that her psychological capabilities exceeded the limitations that had been assumed throughout her military career. The extreme conditions designed to reveal her breaking point had instead demonstrated mental resilience that surprised both herself and her evaluators. Whether this resilience would prove sufficient for the remaining challenges remained unknown, but Emma had already achieved more than anyone expected by maintaining effective cognitive function under psychological pressure that had broken experienced combat veterans. The impossible course was proving difficult but not impossible, suggesting that her critics' assumptions about her limitations might have been based on institutional biases rather than accurate assessments of her actual psychological capabilities under extreme stress. Phase 4 began without warning or transition, as the command center environment dissolved around Emma and reformed into what appeared to be a prisoner interrogation facility. The sterile walls were replaced by concrete surfaces, stained with what looked like years of use, and the comfortable command chair was exchanged for a metal stool that created physical discomfort, while she attempted to maintain cognitive focus on new challenges that tested completely different aspects of psychological resilience. The lighting shifted to harsh fluorescent tubes that created visual fatigue, while the temperature dropped to levels that required constant attention to maintain physical comfort. Emma realized that the environmental changes were designed to create additional stress while she dealt with whatever psychological challenges Phase 4 would introduce, ensuring that previous adaptations became inadequate for new conditions. A new voice spoke through speakers hidden in the walls, belonging to someone Emma hadn't encountered before. The speaker identified himself as Colonel Marcus Harrison, though Emma suspected this was another psychological manipulation designed to create uncertainty about who was actually controlling her evaluation and what their motivations might be for testing her limits. Lieutenant Rodriguez Phase 4 involves resistance to psychological manipulation techniques that simulate capture and interrogation by hostile forces. You will be subjected to methods designed to compromise your mental defenses while maintaining your ability to protect classified information and preserve your psychological integrity under extreme duress. Emma felt her stomach tighten as she realized that Phase 4 would test her ability to resist psychological torture rather than demonstrate leadership or decision-making capabilities. The challenge would require maintaining mental strength while experiencing deliberate attempts to break her psychological defenses through methods designed to exceed human tolerance for psychological pain. The first interrogation session began with questions about Emma's personal background, family relationships, and private fears that had somehow been discovered through research into her psychological profile. The interrogator's knowledge of intimate details created immediate vulnerability while demonstrating that her psychological defenses could be circumvented through information she hadn't known was available. Colonel Harrison's voice carried practiced authority as he demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of Emma's personal life, including details about her relationship with her sister Carmen, her concerns about her parents' financial security, and her private doubts about her military career that she'd never discussed with anyone. Lieutenant Rodriguez, we know about your sister's struggles with debt and your parents' medical expenses. We understand that your military career represents the primary financial support for your family, and we recognize that failure in this assessment could eliminate the career advancement necessary to continue providing that support. Emma recognized that the interrogator was using her genuine concern for her family's welfare as psychological leverage, creating emotional pressure that had nothing to do with military information or operational security. The technique was designed to make her psychologically vulnerable while testing whether personal attachments could be exploited to compromise her professional integrity. The interrogation continued with increasingly personal questions about Emma's private insecurities, romantic relationships, and professional disappointments that created psychological pain through forced examination of sensitive topics she preferred not to discuss, even with close friends. The emotional exposure felt more invasive than physical torture would have been. The interrogator introduced photographs that appeared to show Emma's family members in situations that suggested they were under surveillance or potential threat. Though Emma's rational mind knew the images were likely fabricated, the emotional impact of seeing simulated danger to people she loved created genuine psychological distress that was difficult to manage through logical analysis. Dr. Chen's clinical voice provided commentary on Emma's psychological responses to the interrogation techniques, analyzing her emotional reactions as data points while treating her psychological pain as scientifically interesting rather than humanly significant. Subject demonstrates strong emotional responses to family-related psychological pressure, indicating potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited during actual interrogation scenarios. Note elevated stress markers and decreased cognitive function when personal attachments are threatened through simulated evidence of danger to family members. Emma realized that her normal emotional responses to threats against loved ones were being interpreted as psychological weaknesses that could compromise her effectiveness during capture scenarios. The clinical analysis of her humanity created additional psychological pressure while suggesting that emotional attachments made her unsuitable for operations where capture was possible. The interrogation techniques escalated to include sleep deprivation through strobe lighting and random noise that prevented any possibility of rest, while physical discomfort was increased through temperature manipulation and furniture designed to create pain during extended periods of sitting or standing. Emma found herself fighting multiple psychological battles simultaneously, resisting the interrogation pressure, managing physical discomfort, dealing with sleep deprivation, and maintaining cognitive function despite the cumulative stress from previous phases of the course that continued affecting her mental resources. Colonel Harrison introduced time distortion techniques that made it impossible to track how long the interrogation had been continuing or estimate how much longer it might last. The uncertainty created additional psychological pressure while preventing Emma from developing endurance strategies based on anticipated duration of the challenges. Lieutenant Rodriguez, you've been here for 6 hours. or perhaps 12 hours, or maybe 18 hours. Time becomes meaningless when you're experiencing the kind of psychological pressure that breaks down normal mental defenses. How long do you think you can continue resisting before your psychological integrity begins to deteriorate? Emma recognized that the time disorientation was designed to create hopelessness about the duration of her ordeal while making it impossible to pace her psychological resources appropriately. Without reliable information about how long the interrogation would continue, she couldn't develop sustainable approaches to resistance. The interrogation incorporated false information about Emma's military colleagues, suggesting that other personnel had provided negative assessments of her capabilities, that her instructors had never believed she was suitable for special operations, and that her participation in the course was considered a waste of resources by military leadership. The lies were sophisticated enough to include partially accurate details that made the false information psychologically convincing, creating doubt about Emma's relationships with colleagues and superiors, while undermining her confidence in her professional standing within the military community. Dr. Chen announced that the interrogation phase would continue indefinitely until Emma either demonstrated psychological breakdown that required medical intervention or showed evidence of compromised psychological integrity that indicated she would be vulnerable to actual enemy interrogation techniques. Emma realized that Phase 4 had no predetermined endpoint based on time passage or completed challenges. Instead, it would continue until the researchers determined that she had reached psychological limits that disqualified her from special operations roles, or until she demonstrated resistance capabilities that exceeded their assessment criteria. The interrogation techniques began incorporating sensory manipulation that created disorientation and confusion while preventing Emma from maintaining clear thinking about her situation. Sounds that seemed to come from inside her head, visual effects that made the room appear to change size and shape, and tactile sensations that had no apparent source created psychological conditions that challenged her perception of reality. Emma found herself struggling to distinguish between genuine sensory input and artificial effects created by the interrogation environment, while maintaining rational analysis of her situation despite psychological pressure designed to compromise her judgment and decision-making capabilities. Colonel Harrison's voice began incorporating subliminal suggestions that Emma should accept defeat and request termination of her course participation, while providing seemingly logical justifications for why continued resistance was pointless and potentially harmful to her long-term psychological health. The subliminal pressure created internal dialogue about whether continuing the course represented determination or self-destructive stubbornness, while making it difficult to assess her actual psychological condition objectively, because the assessment process itself was being manipulated by external suggestions. Emma recognized that the interrogation was designed to create exactly the kind of psychological confusion and self-doubt that would make her vulnerable to manipulation during actual capture scenarios. The techniques were testing whether she could maintain psychological autonomy while experiencing deliberate attempts to compromise her mental independence. The physical discomfort increased through temperature extremes that made concentration difficult, while lighting conditions created visual fatigue that interfered with cognitive processing. Emma found herself expending significant mental energy on basic environmental adaptation that reduced the psychological resources available for resisting interrogation pressure. Dr. Chen's monitoring commentary indicated that Emma's stress responses were approaching levels where previous participants had typically experienced psychological breakdown requiring immediate medical intervention. But Emma's subjective experience suggested that her mental clarity remained adequate for continued resistance despite the artificial stressors. The gap between objective stress measurements and Emma's actual psychological condition created uncertainty about whether the monitoring criteria accurately reflected individual resilience variations or were based on assumptions about stress tolerance that didn't account for different adaptive strategies. And after what felt like many hours but could have been any duration given the time distortion techniques, Emma noticed that her psychological responses to the interrogation pressure were stabilizing rather than deteriorating progressively. She was developing mental strategies that maintained resistance while managing the cumulative stress from multiple sources. Colonel Harrison's interrogation techniques began showing signs of frustration as Emma's resistance proved more effective than anticipated. The psychological manipulation that had successfully broken previous participants was failing to create the kind of mental breakdown that would justify terminating her course participation. The interrogation incorporated increasingly desperate attempts to find psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to compromise Emma's mental defenses. Personal attacks on her competence, threats against her family, and suggestions about her professional inadequacy were delivered with increasing intensity that suggested the interrogators were struggling to achieve their objectives. Emma realized that her unexpected resistance to psychological manipulation was creating problems for the course administrators, who had designed the interrogation phase based on assumptions about her mental limitations that were proving inaccurate under actual testing conditions. Dr. Chen announced that Phase 4 evaluation was approaching completion, but that the psychological pressure from interrogation techniques would continue throughout the remaining phases of the course. Emma would face additional challenges while managing the cumulative mental stress from simulated capture and torture. Emma prepared for Phase 5 with growing confidence that her psychological resilience exceeded all previous assessments of her capabilities under extreme stress. The interrogation techniques designed to break her mental defenses had instead demonstrated psychological strength that surprised both herself and her evaluators. The impossible course was revealing mental capabilities that had never been properly tested because no one had created conditions demanding enough to challenge her actual limitations rather than institutional assumptions about those limitations. Whether her resistance would prove sufficient for the remaining phases remained unknown, but Emma had already demonstrated psychological resilience under conditions that had defeated experienced special operations personnel, suggesting that her critics' assessments had been based on prejudice rather than accurate evaluation of her capabilities. The interrogation had been designed to prove her psychological unsuitability for elite military roles, but instead it was providing evidence that her mental strength had been systematically underestimated throughout her military career by evaluators who confused different approaches to challenges with inferior capabilities under pressure. Phase 5 emerged from the interrogation environment like a nightmare transforming into a different kind of hell. The concrete walls dissolved into what appeared to be a survival scenario, where Emma found herself in a simulated wilderness environment, with minimal resources and instructions that seemed designed to create impossible choices between competing survival priorities. The temperature had dropped to near freezing levels, and artificial wind created conditions that made every movement a deliberate effort against environmental resistance. Dr. Chen's voice echoed through hidden speakers, explaining that Phase 5 would test Emma's ability to maintain rational decision-making while experiencing resource scarcity that simulated the psychological pressure of extended survival situations. Every choice about food, water, shelter, and energy expenditure would create consequences that affected her ability to handle subsequent challenges. Lieutenant Rodriguez, you have access to limited survival resources that must be managed over an unknown duration. Your decisions about resource allocation will determine your physical and psychological condition during the remaining phases of the course, but you have no information about what those phases will require or how long your resources must last. Emma surveyed the available materials, a small amount of water, basic food rations, minimal shelter components, and tools that could serve multiple purposes depending on how she chose to use them. The resource limitations created immediate psychological pressure because any consumption reduced her future options while any conservation risked immediate deterioration of her condition. The environmental conditions made it impossible to remain comfortable without expending resources, but using those resources too quickly could leave her completely vulnerable during later phases of the course. Emma realized that Phase 5 was testing her ability to make strategic decisions about survival priorities while managing the psychological stress of uncertainty about future requirements. Commander Walsh's voice provided periodic updates about Emma's resource consumption that created additional psychological pressure by suggesting that her choices were being continuously evaluated according to unknown criteria. The monitoring commentary treated her survival decisions as evidence of her suitability for special operations roles where resource management could determine mission success. Lieutenant Rodriguez, your water consumption rate exceeds optimal conservation parameters for unknown duration survival scenarios. Special operations personnel must demonstrate ability to prioritize long-term survival over immediate comfort when operating in environments where resupply is impossible. Emma recognized that her natural inclination to maintain adequate hydration was being interpreted as evidence of poor survival judgment, but she also understood that severe dehydration could compromise her cognitive function during later phases in ways that would be more problematic than resource depletion. The survival scenario incorporated psychological elements that went beyond physical resource management. Emma was required to make decisions about whether to attempt escape from the survival area, which could either lead to discovery of additional resources or result in penalties that reduced her existing supplies even further. The temptation to explore beyond the immediate survival area created internal conflict between conservative resource management and the possibility that aggressive action might improve her situation. Without information about the consequences of different choices, every decision carried risks that could prove catastrophic for her chances of completing the remaining phases. Dr. Chen announced that the survival phase would continue until Emma either demonstrated resource management skills adequate for extended special operations deployments or showed evidence of decision-making deterioration that indicated she would be unable to function effectively during prolonged missions without resupply support. Emma realized that Phase 5 had no predetermined duration based on time passage, but would continue until the researchers determined that she had either proven or disproven her capability for independent operation under resource constraints that characterized the most demanding special operations assignments. The environmental conditions became increasingly harsh as the phase progressed, with temperature fluctuations that made it impossible to maintain consistent comfort levels regardless of how she managed her shelter resources. The artificial weather created additional stress while testing her ability to adapt to changing conditions without adequate equipment. Emma found herself developing resource management strategies that balanced immediate survival needs against unknown future requirements, creating hybrid approaches that hadn't been part of her formal survival training but seemed appropriate for the extreme uncertainty built into the course design. The psychological pressure of resource scarcity began affecting Emma's decision-making in ways that the monitoring equipment documented with scientific precision. Her choices became more conservative as her supplies dwindled, but the conservation strategies reduced her immediate physical comfort in ways that could compromise her cognitive function. Commander Walsh introduced additional complications by providing false information about the duration of the survival phase, suggesting alternately that it would end soon or continue indefinitely depending on her performance. The uncertainty prevented Emma from developing rational resource allocation strategies based on realistic timeline estimates. Emma recognized that the misinformation was designed to create psychological pressure that would lead to either wasteful consumption based on false expectations of short duration or dangerous conservation based on false expectations of extended requirements. Either response could be criticized as evidence of poor judgment under uncertainty. The survival scenario incorporated moral dilemmas where Emma could improve her situation by making choices that violated ethical principles she had maintained throughout her military career. She was presented with opportunities to secure additional resources through methods that would compromise her integrity while improving her physical condition. The ethical challenges tested whether resource scarcity would cause Emma to abandon moral principles in favor of survival priorities, while evaluating her ability to maintain psychological integrity even when facing conditions that made ethical behavior potentially self-destructive. Dr. Chen's monitoring commentary analyzed Emma's responses to moral pressure as indicators of her suitability for operations where personnel might face situations requiring choices between survival and ethical conduct. The clinical evaluation treated moral consistency as a variable that could be measured and compared across different participants. Subject maintains ethical decision-making standards despite resource scarcity that creates pressure for survival-oriented compromises. Note potential limitations for operations requiring flexible moral frameworks when mission success conflicts with conventional ethical principles. Emma realized that her commitment to ethical behavior was being interpreted as inflexibility that could limit her effectiveness in operations where moral compromise might be necessary for mission success. The evaluation suggested that maintaining integrity under pressure was a psychological limitation rather than professional strength. The environmental conditions continued deteriorating throughout Phase 5, with artificial weather that created survival challenges requiring constant adaptation of resource management strategies. Emma found herself expending physical energy on environmental protection that reduced her overall reserves while potentially compromising her condition for later phases. The cumulative effects of resource scarcity, environmental stress, and psychological pressure from previous phases began creating physical fatigue that affected Emma's cognitive capabilities. She noticed decreased efficiency in problem-solving and decision-making that could indicate approaching psychological limits. But Emma also recognized that her fundamental analytical capabilities remained functional despite the multiple stressors, suggesting that her mental resilience continued exceeding the expectations built into the course design. The physical deterioration was manageable within limits that allowed continued effective performance. Commander Walsh announced that Phase 5 evaluation was nearing completion, with Emma's resource management demonstrating adequate capability for extended independent operations despite environmental conditions that had created significant challenges for previous participants. Emma prepared for the transition to Phase 6 with the knowledge that she had successfully managed survival challenges that were designed to test her psychological limits under resource scarcity. Her performance had exceeded expectations while maintaining ethical standards that some evaluators considered potentially limiting. The impossible course continued proving difficult but manageable, with Emma's psychological resilience consistently exceeding institutional assumptions about her capabilities under extreme stress. Each phase revealed mental strength that had never been properly tested because no one had created conditions demanding enough to challenge her actual limitations. Whether her resilience would prove sufficient for the final phases remained unknown, but Emma had already demonstrated survival capabilities under conditions that defeated other participants, providing additional evidence that her critics' assessments had been based on prejudice rather than accurate evaluation of her psychological resources. Phase 6 and 7 blurred together in a final crucible that tested every psychological resource Emma had developed. The course designers threw simultaneous challenges at her: complex tactical decisions while exhausted, leadership scenarios with uncooperative subordinates, and moral dilemmas with no clear solutions. Her body screamed for rest, her mind begged for relief, but Emma pressed forward with methodical determination. On Day 7, Hour 23, when Dr. Chen expected to document another psychological breakdown, something unprecedented happened. Emma didn't just survive the final challenge. She excelled, demonstrating tactical brilliance that surpassed seasoned veterans. Master Chief Thompson entered the monitoring room as Emma completed the course, becoming the first person in program history to finish all 7 days. His expression shifted from disbelief to grudging respect as he reviewed her performance metrics. "Rodriguez," he said as she emerged from the course environment, "I owe you an apology and a conversation about your next assignment." 6 months later, Lieutenant Commander Emma Rodriguez stood before a packed auditorium at the Naval War College, delivering the keynote address on psychological resilience to an audience of special operations commanders from around the world. The techniques she had developed during her impossible week were now being studied and implemented across multiple elite units. Her course completion hadn't just proven her capabilities, it had revolutionized how the military understood psychological strength under extreme pressure. The assumption that certain people were too fragile for elite operations was being replaced by recognition that resilience came in many forms. The commanders who had once dismissed her now sought her expertise in developing training programs that identified hidden psychological strengths rather than confirming institutional biases. If this story of hidden strength overcoming impossible odds inspired you, smash that subscribe button and join our community celebrating everyday heroes who prove that limitations are often just untested assumptions. What impossible challenge have you conquered by refusing to accept others' expectations? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might be our next inspiring video. Mori loy.